Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most uncomfortable truths about human relationships, the painful moment when people stop matching the version we created in our minds. Because sometimes the greatest emotional awakening doesn't come from love or loyalty. It comes from disappointment, silence, distance, and finally seeing people exactly as they are. Disappointing people often reveal more about human nature than loyal people ever could, because loyalty is easy to misunderstand. Some people stay because they genuinely care about you. Others stay because you are convenient, emotionally available, forgiving, useful, or willing to tolerate what others would never accept. And most individuals never recognize the difference until disappointment forces them to. One of the deepest psychological illusions people carry is the illusion of the idealized person. Not because humans are naturally evil, but because the mind desperately wants harmony between what it hopes and what it experiences. So when someone exposes selfishness, emotional manipulation, envy, or quiet cowardice, most people instinctively resist the truth. Not intentionally, psychologically. Because accepting reality would also require admitting something far more painful. I was attached to the version of them I created in my own mind. And for many people, that realization wounds the ego more than the betrayal itself. Most emotional suffering doesn't come from toxic individuals alone. It comes from the fantasy that they were supposed to be different. Once you notice this, you begin seeing it everywhere. The friend who only reaches out when they need emotional support or favors. The partner who slowly becomes distant the moment you stop serving their emotional needs. The family member who encourages you only as long as your growth doesn't threaten their insecurity. But people rarely accept these patterns immediately. Instead, they bargain with reality. Maybe they're just overwhelmed. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe if I become more patient, more understanding, more available, they'll finally become who I believed they were. But reality has a brutal consistency. Patterns repeat louder than promises ever do. And eventually, life corners you into seeing people without emotional filters or hopeful editing. That moment changes everything. Not because love dies, but because projection dies. Most people don't truly see others clearly. They see their own unmet emotional needs reflected onto them. The need to feel chosen, the need to feel important, the need to believe unconditional loyalty still exists somewhere untouched by human weakness, so they create emotional fiction around ordinary behavior. And the darker truth is this: many people benefit from your refusal to see them honestly. Your optimism protects them. Your empathy excuses them. Your patience delays consequences. Kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to misuse your loyalty. That idea makes people uncomfortable because it destroys the comforting belief that goodness automatically inspires goodness in return. It doesn't. Sometimes it creates dependency, sometimes manipulation, sometimes silent disrespect. Because human beings often respect what they cannot easily control. People notice far more than they admit. They notice who fears abandonment, who avoids conflict, who keeps explaining themselves, who forgives repeatedly even after trust has already been damaged. And slowly, often unconsciously, the relationship shifts. Not always through cruelty, through human nature. And this is where disappointment becomes transformative. Because the moment you allow people to disappoint you, you stop needing them to maintain the fantasy you created around them. You begin observing behavior without emotional distortion. And once that happens, nearly every relationship in your life starts changing shape. Most people think disappointment destroys relationships, but usually, disappointment simply reveals the relationship that already existed underneath the illusion. The illusion dies first, and what replaces it can feel deeply unsettling. Because once you stop idealizing people, patterns become impossible to ignore. You begin noticing how some people only become warm when they fear losing access to you, how certain friends disguise jealousy as jokes, how some relationships survive entirely on your emotional effort, while the other person contributes almost nothing except occasional attention. At first, these realizations feel harsh, not because they are false, but because they destroy innocence. There is a version of maturity nobody prepares you for. It is not becoming wiser. It is becoming emotionally difficult to deceive. Human beings carry hidden aspects within themselves. Not just anger or aggression, but envy, insecurity, manipulation, cowardice, and the desperate need to control how others perceive them. Most people spend their entire lives pretending these traits only belong to terrible individuals, but disappointment changes that illusion, because eventually you realize something uncomfortable. The people who hurt you were often protecting their own ego the entire time. The friend who betrayed you may have secretly envied your growth long before they disappeared. The partner who withdrew emotionally may have feared intimacy more than loneliness itself. The person who constantly lied may not even hate you. They simply feared being seen honestly. Human beings protect identity before truth far more often than they admit. And once you understand that, social behavior begins looking completely different. Compliments become easier to decode. Apologies start sounding rehearsed. Attention begins feeling conditional. You start noticing how often people perform emotions instead of genuinely feeling them. Not because humanity is fake, but because survival taught many people to wear masks long before they ever developed self-awareness. That is why disappointment feels psychologically violent. It doesn't only expose other people, it exposes how desperately you wanted the illusion to survive. And perhaps the hardest truth of all is this: people rarely resent your weakness as much as they resent the possibility that you might outgrow them. Because growth changes emotional balance. The moment you become less dependent, less controllable, less desperate for validation, certain people begin responding differently to your presence. Not because you changed into someone cruel, but because you stopped being easy to emotionally manage. Not openly, but quietly, subtly. They become colder around you, less encouraging, more sarcastic, more emotionally distant. And if you still carry the old belief that genuine people always want the best for you, this shift feels deeply confusing. But the uncomfortable truth is that many people only feel comfortable with the version of you that keeps their own insecurities undisturbed. The predictable version, the apologetic version, the smaller version, the version that never forces them to confront their own lack of growth. And disappointment becomes the doorway into finally recognizing this clearly. Not emotionally, structurally. You begin realizing that many relationships are built on silent psychological agreements. I will stay this version of myself if you stay yours. That's why transformation unsettles people. Because your growth silently breaks the emotional contract. Suddenly, your boundaries feel offensive to them. Your silence feels arrogant. Your independence feels personal. And the strange part is that most people won't consciously understand why their behavior changes toward you. Human beings usually explain emotions after they already feel them. First comes discomfort. Then the mind creates a story to justify it. That's why some individuals slowly pull away after you begin healing. Not because healing made you worse, but because awareness made you harder to emotionally control. There's a stage that comes after disappointment that almost feels unnatural. Not external silence, internal silence, the kind that appears when you stop searching for explanations, you stop rereading old conversations, stop analyzing mixed signals, stop trying to rescue the image you once had of someone. And strangely, that silence often hurts more than the betrayal itself, because the human mind survives through narrative. As long as you are still searching for reasons, some part of you still believes the illusion can be repaired. But the moment acceptance arrives, something colder enters your awareness. Clarity. And clarity rarely feels emotionally comforting. You begin remembering moments differently. The joke that carried hidden disrespect, the fake concern disguised as advice, the quiet competition underneath friendship. the way certain people disappeared the moment you stopped being emotionally useful to them. At first, you wonder whether you are becoming cynical. But cynicism is not the same as awareness. Cynicism assumes everyone is malicious. Awareness simply recognizes that most people are internally divided. Human beings are contradictions pretending to appear emotionally consistent. Someone can care about you while secretly resenting you, support you publicly while privately competing with you, need your presence while simultaneously feeling threatened by your growth. And much of human tension comes from this hidden duality, because people often speak consciously while their behavior reveals something entirely different underneath. That is why actions feel psychologically louder than words. Words are edited. Behavior leaks truth. And once you recognize this, it becomes difficult to ignore it again. You begin observing how often people communicate through implication instead of honesty. The delayed response designed to establish emotional power. The calculated withdrawal of attention, the inconsistency that keeps others uncertain and emotionally attached. Most people never consciously identify these patterns, but their nervous system feels them immediately. That's why certain relationships leave you emotionally drained even when nothing obviously wrong happened. Your body notices manipulation long before your mind fully accepts it, and eventually another realization emerges. Some people are not attached to you. They are attached to access. Access to your energy, your reassurance, your attention, your forgiveness, your emotional availability. And once that access changes, their behavior changes too. That realization breaks something inside deeply idealistic people because they spent years believing effort naturally creates loyalty. But sometimes effort simply increases consumption. The more you give, the more people normalize receiving until your presence becomes expected instead of appreciated. Most relationships do not collapse when respect disappears. They collapse when awareness appears. And that is why disappointment feels so lonely sometimes. Not because nobody exists, but because your perception changed faster than your emotional attachment did. Part of you still loves the person. Another part finally sees them clearly. And those two realities begin fighting inside your mind. This is the real confrontation with the shadow. Not confronting darkness in others, but confronting your own resistance to reality because reality threatened your emotional needs. Because if you finally admit someone never valued you the way you imagined, then you must also face another painful question. Why did you accept so little for so long? That question changes people quietly, permanently. Because eventually you realize the deepest betrayals are rarely sudden. They are prolonged patterns you noticed early, but emotionally negotiated with instead. And once you understand that, the past begins rearranging itself inside your memory. Not dramatically, more like a slow correction of vision. You start seeing how many times your intuition warned you before reality confirmed it, the hesitation in someone's tone, the envy hidden beneath support, the emotional distance that appeared whenever you succeeded. Your body noticed. Your mind simply refused to cooperate, because human beings are deeply attached to emotional continuity. We often prefer familiar pain over unfamiliar truth. That is why people stay too long in relationships that quietly drain them. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because uncertainty feels more terrifying than disappointment. At least disappointment still allows fantasy. Truth removes it completely. And this is where real psychological transformation begins, not in confidence, not in admiration, not in becoming emotionally untouchable, but in separating perception from projection, in learning to see people without forcing your unmet emotional needs onto them. Most people never fully do this. Instead, they repeat the same emotional patterns with different faces, different friendships, different relationships, different betrayals. But underneath, the same unresolved structure remains, because the unconscious repeats what has not been healed. That is why some people continuously attract manipulators, emotionally unavailable partners, or draining friendships. Not because they deserve pain, but because familiarity creates unconscious attraction. Dysfunction can start feeling like chemistry when emotional chaos becomes normalized. And strangely, this is where disappointment becomes liberating. Because the more clearly you understand human nature, the less personally you take its contradictions. You stop expecting permanence from temporary people. You stop confusing attention with loyalty. You stop romanticizing inconsistency as depth. And perhaps most importantly, you stop trying to rescue people who are committed to avoiding themselves. That realization alone can save years of emotional exhaustion, because many people are not searching for truth. They are searching for comfort, even if that comfort slowly destroys who they really are. People want comfort that protects identity, and truth becomes dangerous the moment it threatens the image someone has spent years building around themselves. The image of being innocent, superior, misunderstood, in control, victimized. If reality challenges that identity, many people will distort reality before they abandon the version of themselves they emotionally depend on. That is why accountability feels so rare. Not because people are incapable of reflection, but because real reflection often requires a kind of psychological death. The death of ego. An ego death feels emotionally violent to most human beings. Many people would rather lose relationships than lose identity. Read that carefully. People will often sacrifice connection in order to protect the version of themselves they've invested in emotionally. And suddenly, old experiences begin making sense. The friend who twisted every disagreement until somehow you became the problem. The partner who constantly rewrote history during arguments. The family member who denied obvious emotional harm while still demanding loyalty and obedience. It was not always calculated cruelty. Sometimes it was self-protection, operating at such a deep psychological level that even they could not fully recognize it inside themselves. That is why blind morality can be dangerous. People who believe they are good often stop examining themselves completely, and unconscious people can create enormous emotional damage precisely because they never question their own motives deeply enough to notice what they are doing. And perhaps one of the darkest realizations arrives here. The more self-aware you become, the harder it becomes to participate in shallow social illusions. Certain conversations begin feeling performative. Some friendships start feeling emotionally hollow. You begin noticing how much of human interaction operates through mutual pretending. Pretending to care, pretending to listen, pretending to support, pretending to be emotionally honest. Not always maliciously. Sometimes people have simply become disconnected from themselves for so long that performance feels more natural than authenticity. And when you finally understand this, forgiveness starts changing shape. Not the soft version people display publicly to appear spiritually evolved, something quieter, more detached. You stop forgiving because you expect reconciliation. You forgive because you no longer want emotional attachment to illusion. That distinction changes everything, because many people are no longer suffering from betrayal itself. They are suffering from resistance. Resistance to accepting that someone already revealed exactly who they were. The mind keeps reopening old wounds, hoping the past will suddenly transform into a different memory. But it never does. People rarely become painful overnight. The signs usually existed in fragments from the very beginning. Tiny inconsistencies, small emotional absences, moments that felt slightly wrong. But hope stitched those fragments together into a false image. And hope can become psychologically dangerous, especially for lonely people, especially for deeply empathetic people, especially for those who secretly believe love must be earned through endurance. Those individuals tolerate things others would walk away from immediately. Disrespect becomes stress, neglect becomes confusion, manipulation becomes misunderstanding, and slowly they abandon their own perception just to preserve emotional connection. That is why disappointment eventually becomes necessary, not tragic. Necessary, because some illusions only die through repetition. The same emotional cycle appearing through different people again and again until your mind can no longer avoid the pattern. And once the pattern becomes undeniable, something strange begins happening inside you. You stop trying to convince people to value you properly. That urge disappears. Because maturity is realizing that misunderstanding is not always accidental. Some people benefit from minimizing your worth. It protects their ego, preserves emotional control, maintains psychological leverage. Because if they acknowledged your value honestly, they would also have to confront how poorly they treated you. And many individuals will avoid that realization for years, sometimes forever. So instead, they rewrite you. You become too sensitive, too distant, too intense, too complicated. Anything except accurately perceived, because accurate perception creates guilt, and guilt threatens identity. This is why awareness can feel isolating sometimes, not because you become superior to others, but because you stop participating in unconscious emotional contracts. You stop chasing validation from emotionally unavailable people. You stop mistaking inconsistency for depth. You stop treating breadcrumbs like genuine connection. And suddenly, certain social dynamics lose their power over you. Attention stops intoxicating you. Charm stops impressing you. Words stop outweighing behavior. You begin observing people the same way nature observes storms, without personalization, without fantasy, just patterns. And perhaps this is what true consciousness really means: not becoming perfect, but becoming honest enough to see reality without constantly reshaping it to protect emotional comfort. Because the human mind loves romanticizing what hurts it, assigning depth to neglect, mystery to inconsistency, meaning to emotional confusion. But clarity removes unnecessary suffering. The moment you stop asking, "How do I finally make them understand my value?" another question quietly appears. Why was I fighting so hard to be valued by someone incapable of seeing me clearly in the first place? That question changes your standards permanently. Because once awareness enters a relationship, illusion can never fully return again. And after enough disappointment, you stop fearing the loss of people. You begin fearing the loss of self-respect required to keep them. That is the paradox nobody explains. The more clearly you understand human nature, the less hatred you carry. Because hatred still contains attachment, expectation, emotional investment. Awareness becomes quieter than hatred. You simply stop arguing with reality. You stop expecting emotionally unconscious people to suddenly become self-aware because you loved them correctly. You stop expecting loyalty from people whose identity depends on convenience. You stop expecting emotional depth from people terrified of introspection. And slowly, disappointment transforms completely. It no longer feels like punishment. It feels like revelation. Because every disappointment removes another illusion, another projection, another emotional fantasy standing between you and reality. Real enlightenment does not come from pretending darkness doesn't exist. It comes from becoming conscious of truths the ego desperately wants to avoid. The truth that some people only loved your usefulness. Some only loved your attention. Some only loved the version of you that remained easy to control. And perhaps the hardest truth of all, some people never truly knew you. They only knew the role you played in their emotional world, the listener, the helper, the forgiver, the one who always stayed. And the moment you stopped playing that role, the relationship changed. Not because you betrayed them, because you interrupted the illusion. Maybe that is why disappointment changes people so deeply. Not because it destroys innocence, but because it destroys psychological dependence on fantasy. After that, you begin moving through life differently. More observant, more careful with trust, more emotionally aware, not colder, just harder to deceive. And strangely enough, that may be the beginning of real peace. Because peace does not come from believing everyone is good. It comes from finally seeing people clearly and no longer needing them to be anything other than what they are. And before you go, leave a comment describing the disappointment that permanently changed the way you see human nature.